philosophy, questioning, enlightenment, deep conversation, spirituality. This is the Spiritual Download. Welcome to the Spiritual Download. Today, my guest is Jackson Holzberg Buckley. Hello, Jackson.
Hey.
So today, our first question, this is going to be more of a conversation style than necessarily an interview. My first question, though, is what is your spiritual story? And where you can start anywhere, but where for you is when your spirituality really began to take off?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer because there was the point at which I became more aware of my spirituality. There was also the point at which I became more confident in sharing my spirituality with others and began trying to inform my work and other aspects of my life with my spirituality. And that was very recent. And then there was the point that I had strong spiritual inclinations or feelings, which is really like coincident with my birth. You know, that's my entire life. So if I think back to when I was very, very young, I have always had a kind of quiet intelligence about me. And what I mean by that is a sense that we are all connected, that harming others is wrong, that conflict is unnecessary. These sorts of principles have always been felt by me in my heart. There was a long phase starting in adolescence and leading into young adulthood where I tried to suppress that part of myself. I think because I was afraid of the social consequences of sharing it with others. There was the point where living in that way really ceased to work for me. And I got the message like, okay, to the degree that I bury this part of myself and live falsely, my life will end up in catastrophe. That's like a necessary equation. And so then circuitously, I found my way back to my spirituality and became able to own it and live from it. But you see what I mean? It's not like it was ever really gone. I just suppressed it for my awareness.
Almost for like the purpose of like surviving in this society. Like you went to school. I feel like I don't know if this was for you, but also like junior high school were pivotal years for you almost to like forget your childhoodness, kind of that innocence, and then you're taught to like be this hard survivor in this like machine like society. For me it was definitely sports. I was taught like, sports were my life until I was like 15, and then that shifted for me big time. Like, whoa, sports aren't everything. It's not all about sports aren't all about life. I don't know what were some of your experiences with like junior high school.
Yeah, definitely the same time period. But as you were saying that, I was thinking you're probably better at sports than I am because that wasn't like the chief venue for me. Yeah, in fact, I quit the cross country team because I wasn't as fast as I wanted to be. And I was later shamed for it. I went to a meet and my old coach was there and she goes, "Hello, quitter." And I was like, oh. But yeah, for me, I'm a very intellectual person, as you are also. I just from the briefest of interactions, I can tell that. And for me, that is what it was channeled into. I don't think there's anything wrong with intellect in pure form. I really enjoy playing with my mind, using my mind to translate my spiritual insights to the world, and playing games with others, which is a way of inviting them into vulnerability. but through that age of like the shame and the self-consciousness that we're talking about, my mind became a shield for me, a shield and a weapon, right? I'm going to use it to protect myself from criticism, and I'm going to use it to attack others, which is a way of deflecting attention from myself. And that was what I did through college and beyond college. Really, like, rather than delve into the practical matters of like, who am I and what am I going to do with my life, I was like, well, I've been geared by the system to be smart, so I'm going to continue doing that, and I'm going to become smarter and smarter. And it, you know, as I said earlier, like, it didn't work. So that was the crisis point for me.
So did that become an identity for you as like the smart guy?
Yeah, I would say that was my chief identity, like the intellectual, and also the suffering artist was another aspect of my identity. So I wrote a lot of fiction. So like I was someone who was always reading and had read many obscure and difficult things, and also was constantly writing fiction, even if I hadn't published it. I'm like, oh yeah, I wrote like 3 novels, you know. Yeah, and for me, like, the end of that pathway was isolation, because the mind, when divorced from the heart and body, always has to be right, which means always has to be in conflict with everyone else, and drawing a distinction. And so I just saw that I could never have relationships or intimacy if I lived my life in that way.
Were there any really important books for you that you read that were just kind of perspective shifting for you?
Um, I don't know if it happened through my reading as much. Well, I suppose it was a synthesis of like reading and experience. One of my favorite books of all time is Letting Go by David Hawkins. I'm curious if you've read that. I read that at a
I've
very,
not read, but I've listened to many podcasts of him.
yeah. That came at a very pivotal point for me. Just this notion of surrender as something worth engaging in has continued to steer my life since then. And yeah, again, it met me at that point of crisis that I was speaking about a moment ago, you know, because I thought, if I don't have this identity, if I don't have this control, then what do I have? And Hawkins's whole thing is like, whatever is emerging, just let it go and trust. And that's basically impossible for the mind to do, but it's very natural for spirit to do. And so as one relaxes into that, spirituality comes to the fore, and it's like, oh, I always have this. It has nothing to do with me, in a sense. Like, it's not a skill, you know, it's a birthright. All humans have access to it, and so I can just rest in it and be in gratitude, which is a totally different orientation to life. It's very freeing in a way.
So was that kind of your introduction to non-dual ideas, like kind of, I guess, um, and then how would you define non-duality, I guess? So kind of 2 double questions, I guess. Sorry.
You're assuming I know what that is.
Um,
I'm joking. I mean,
okay, okay.
in some sense, but it's just funny. Well, no, come to think of it, and like, yeah, as someone who's read a lot, there were a lot of pivotal books. It's just that Letting Go is the one that feels the most pivotal, like it was at an axis point. But the first time I was introduced to non-dualism, or really just an Eastern way of thinking, I would say, that challenged the metaphysics I learned in school. I know you and I have both studied philosophy. I remember when I first read the Tao Te Ching, and there was, and that was like right after I graduated from college, so it was earlier than the period I'm talking about. And there was an introduction to it. I forget who wrote the introduction, but it was like 10 pages, and it was just on Western versus Eastern philosophy, and how, from the perspective of Eastern philosophy, Western philosophy is founded on untrue assumptions. And that like blew my mind. I really didn't know what to make of it at the time. So that I would say was more my introduction rather than David Hawkins. But it's almost like when I read the Tao Te Ching, I was still so much living from the mind that that philosophy was just incorporated as part of my data set. And I had to have the experience of my ideology ceasing to function in order to become like open to that way of thinking from the heart, which is a different form of reception in my view. It's much more holistic.
So when did you start kind of moving down? I mean, not exclusive, like not ignoring the mind, but when did you start moving down towards the heart? What were some of the moments for that?
Well, the really pivotal experience for me was a shooting that happened in Colorado Springs when I was living there. I was 25 at the time. And I was tutoring writing at my old college, and I went away for the weekend. It was Halloween weekend. And in the time I was away, this man who lived across the street from me came out of his house and shot 3 people and then was himself killed by the police. So it was a mass shooting by definition because 4 people died. And I don't know, there was just this awareness in me that the way I was living was not that different from that man. What I mean by that is we were both very isolated and very like mentally defined. He released this screed online before he did what he did, that signaled a very alienated consciousness. And there was just a part of me that knew I am like that too. You know, I live in my mind. I have my mental pursuits. I don't have strong connections to people in the world. And at some level, I'm at risk of this same kind of outcome. And so I really began to seek out and prioritize like relationships and therapy and things like that, which reacquainted me with the other elements of myself beyond my mind. So yeah, in a way, I view that experience as a huge gift and as the start of a spiritual awakening. Like, here is an out picture of where pure mind divorced from other elements will take you, and you can now choose whether you want that or a more integrated path.
Yeah, it seems like one of the elements that you were discussing in your kind of your intro to your first teaching video. I'll probably put a link to that down below here on this video. You kind of mentioned like the thought of insanity, like how when you're speaking to like yourself, some people would consider that insane on a video, but then you were saying, but society probably wouldn't take it that way because of your ability to almost explain your mind. I'm wondering if you actually have had instances where you've felt like, am I going insane? Like, is my mind acting in a way that society wouldn't approve?
Well, I think that's all conditional. I think sanity is really the result of collective agreements about what we trust or value. And it's changing all the time. You look at things that are normal now that 50 years ago would have been taboo and insane, you know, like meditation and yoga. Those are pretty standard and have even been like diluted and commodified, you know. And yeah,
Yeah, how many hours do you meditate?
yeah, right. And oh, were you actually asking me that? No, I'm just kidding. And
Is this the quiz?
yeah, the rapid fire portion of this. Um, yeah, back in the day, if you did those, you would be put in an institution, right? So, um, yeah, I mean, part of what being a spiritual teacher or seeker is to me is like we are having experiences that are outside the field of the norm. And some of us, myself included, are like well educated enough or well spoken enough or whatever our gift is that we're able to translate those into a channel through which they can be accepted. Um, but again, I didn't choose to be born in the situation I was, which is responsible for my being well educated, you know? And if I wasn't born in that situation, perhaps I wouldn't be able to articulate myself so well. And perhaps I would be like wandering the streets, just talking to myself in an incoherent way. I think it's all societally constructed. I don't know if that makes sense to you or if you disagree.
No, no, that makes total sense. Kind of two things I would say is, for me, the idea of insanity started to come up when I was, a sophomore, junior in high school, and after my sports phase in life, I became very depressed after I realized that sports aren't everything in life, and my consciousness kind of began to expand. I guess my sense of identity began to expand. Instead of like, me and my family and my school, I viewed as us. Then I started to see that like, oh no, us is like the human race. And there's so much suffering by the majority of people in the world. So I started to think about, people of color. I read a lot about Martin Luther King. That's why I got a tattoo, one of his quotes on my back, right when I was 18. That was my 18th birthday present. And that's kind of what led to a lot of depression in my life. And that's when I started to feel like maybe I'm insane. Sometimes like some of my thoughts go by my kind of, society would think is kind of crazy. I started to feel like there were spirits entering my room when I couldn't sleep late at night, which threw me for a loop. Like the walls in my room would either contract or expand. And I felt like I was entering into like this dream world, even though I wasn't sleeping. So then that's kind of when I started to feel like, am I going insane? And then the other one is like lately, I've just been smiling randomly. Like today, I was driving back home from the Twin Cities, and I was just like stopped at the red light, and I was just started to smile while I was listening to a song. And I was just like, maybe people will look at me while I'm smiling at the red light, but I don't really care.
Well, you might think like, sorry to cut you off, but like
Yeah.
how insane does a society have to be where happiness is a marker of insanity?
Yeah, like the guy who smiles by himself is crazy. You got to question like, is society's values, in line.
Well, I have had one experience that comes to mind that is similar to the experiences you just described. And for me, it was after a severe depression. It was in college. And I remember feeling similarly like my sense of the space was distorted. Maybe there were entities coming in and out of the room. Not only difficulty sleeping, but like not certain whether I had slept. Like, was I asleep or was I awake at night? And that happened only one time in my life. And I was like, now it's time to go to a therapist. And that was the first time I did that. But for me too, like, I'm curious whether you agree with this, but I put out a video today on intuition. And I think what is really happening in an experience like that is the soul, and the soul is something that extends beyond the individual self and is accessible to other beings, and I think to other realms as well. It's like beyond space and time. The soul is giving knowledge to the self, which the self doesn't know what to do with. There's a kind of like breach, almost like a computer being overloaded with data or something. It's like you were sensing something beyond your ability to process or translate it. Does that kind of line up with what you were experiencing, or what do you think of it now?
Yeah, definitely. Like I've always, like when I was studying philosophy in college, I actually had this conversation today. Like I can't tell what, like the thoughts that enter my mind. Is it my ego that is thinking some of these thoughts about, truth, ethics, what is real, or is there some sort of like divine intelligence that's entering into my brain? Because it would make sense if my brain is connected to everything else, it has access to that everything else. So maybe at some points, like either ideas from the environment or impressions from the environment, or even like non-physical reality is entering into my mind or my brain. And it's like the philosophy almost just like comes out of me, but also enters into my awareness. And that's kind of for me is also this intuition as the last 2 years of my life, I'm entering back down to my heart as well, where some of these feelings I get or ideas, I don't know exactly where they come from, but I used to think about, like, I used to worry, like, where is this coming from? But now it's just like, whether it's from me, whether it's from God, whether it's from others, it's kind of all the same and deeply, um, where the source of this intelligence is coming from.
Yeah, I feel the same way about it. Like I had a phrase in the video that I put up today. The soul is just happy to be having an experience, and you see, I'm doing the insane smiling thing now, and what I mean by that is like I think often about free will and choice, and this may be true of you as well. I can be an anxious person. I can struggle very much with choice. Which direction is the right one for me? What's going to happen if I choose path A versus path B? And the ramifications can seem very daunting. And I just had this knowing from a level beyond evidence, or beyond the need for evidence, I would say, that from the perspective of the soul, it does not matter. Like, the soul is in the body or in whatever manifestation of matter to have an experience, and any choice I make will generate experience. And so the soul is like, great, let's go this way, let's go that way. Like, it's going to be interesting, it's going to be lively no matter what. And yeah, that thought was just kind of there. It's delightful to be in the process of trusting thoughts like that, and to know that we haven't earned them, that there could be no such thing as ego attachment. Knowledge is just given to us. We didn't do anything to deserve it. It's impartial in that way. So yeah, it is a very odd sensation at first, but it becomes, in my experience, like so delightful to embrace it that it's impossible to go back to the critical mind of doubting or trying to stifle or prove. So that's my experience. There's a point of no return, and then it's just about, how do I function in the world having the orientation I now do, because I can't change it.
Yeah, and when did that shift for you? So I had briefly met you in Quito, Ecuador, about 2015. What was kind of at that point? What was kind of your experience in life? Like, why did you end up teaching English in Quito? What was your experience there? And then also kind of maybe the reverse culture shock coming back to Colorado or the States.
Sure. It was Colorado for me. Yeah, and I'm curious about what you were thinking then too, because I don't know, I don't really have a strong impression of you from that time. We interacted a couple of times. And for your viewers, like, we were in an English teaching program, and you were in the cohort after me. And so I think I interacted with you through like some professional development sessions. But we didn't know each other well. Yeah, I mean, I was still very much in the thrall of what we would think of as the ego then. I would go and meditate sometimes from this mountain near my house in Ecuador, and it was very pretty, but meditation was almost like a form of exercise to me then. It was like I would force myself to do it for 20 or 30 minutes and be proud that I had. And maybe I kind of disassociated through meditating, which felt like peace to me, but there wasn't like a deep understanding of what was going on in life. To me now, I have such an understanding of, okay, the soul is having a spiritual experience, and the soul inhabits all bodies, and we are all connected, and things like that, that even if I'm in an anxious or angry or whatever state of mind, that's superficial. My awareness is identified at a site more deep than that, and that was not the case back in Ecuador. In Ecuador, I was identified with whatever was going on the surface. Now, I think I went there to begin the path of enlarging my perspective. I had a sense that the US was too familiar for me, and I had to shake up my world in a big way. And in hindsight, I am grateful to the experience for that, for starting me on that path. But yeah, I'd like to hear a little bit about like how you were in that time, and what you had read and thought about.
Yeah, so one of the big impetuses for me to go down there is expansion of my comfort zone. Ever since kind of that event in high school that happened to me with the going away from sports thing, my goal was always to broaden my horizon. Like actually my senior year of high school, I actually switched schools. I moved from rural Minnesota by myself to Minneapolis for 6 months.
Wow.
So that was a big event in my life. Like that was kind of like a study abroad program. So that's why. So right after college, I actually stayed an extra semester to get my major in philosophy. I was political science, and I was like, I have to major in philosophy, otherwise I'm gonna regret it. So I did that for 6 months, and then I graduated. And I was like, what am I gonna do with my life? Like literally, like I went to college to learn. I didn't really worry about my career. I was like, my career is just going to happen on its own. I'm going to trust myself and my intuition and the world that I'm going to make some money by being who I am. That might sound crazy to some people, but also that's a sign of, I think that's a sign of some white privilege as well. Coming from a family of middle class, upper middle class background, I knew I had a financial network to rely upon.
Yeah,
So I
the
just,
not worrying about it is a rare position, and I had that as well. And it does. I don't know. I don't want to cut off your story, but perhaps we can touch on later how I think our philosophies on matters like these are conditioned by our life story as well, and that's not something that, at least at the level of the ego, we choose.
yeah, exactly. That's really in line with your point, is that I didn't choose any of this privilege. I kind of view it, I viewed it, I had that white guilt in high school and college of like, why am I the one that was given this privilege? I need to like learn what it's like to not have that privilege. And then in Ecuador, I realized I'll never be like stripped of this white male privilege. I just have to begin to see it as a responsibility. Like I try to use it for the best I can to help others and help myself.
Hmm.
And that was a big thing that I realized kind of halfway through Ecuador, was learning more about other cultures. I wanted to really dive into the Ecuadorian culture and learn as much as I could. I studied Spanish for hours every day. I tried to get in conversations every day, and eventually becoming fluent in Spanish was like probably one of the hardest things I've ever done, but
Hmm.
also was it's a huge task that I took up, and I'm very proud that I did that. So those were kind of the key things, but also the traveling for, you know, a cheap budget. You know, sometimes by myself. I went to Baños by myself for a couple of times, and just trusting that everything's going to be okay. I had my like jacket stolen, but you know, other than that, I was safe. You know, I would hike in the woods in the middle of, I mean, the mountains in the middle of nowhere. I went hiking in the rainforest by myself, which I was like caution, don't do that. You need a guide.
White
But
privilege or no,
yes,
objectively
yes.
dangerous.
And the ants will eat
Mosquitoes do not
anybody.
discriminate.
Yes, the banana spiders will eat anybody. So I was just hung on an adventure um, until I met this guy from Finland. I was hiking with in Kilotoa, and we hiked for 3 days together, and he talked about meditation. And I was like, wow, I've tried meditating before. We talked about yoga, enlightenment, Buddhism, and then our last night we were at this hostel together at the end of the trail, and I tried meditating with him, and we meditated for like a half hour, and I was just like amazed. I was like, it can't be this good. Like my
Hmm.
mind slowed down. I felt my body. I was breathing. And I was like, this is what I want to get into. I
Hmm.
realized that I want to bring my philosophy into this. And then there's about 3 months left of my Ecuador experience, and I began to like meditate in my room by myself, listen to spiritual podcasts by myself, go for really long walks by myself, and basically meditate during that time. I got to know people at this vegetarian monastery in Quito, so it's like in the city in the Central Historical area. I would go there every Sunday to eat a vegetarian lunch and then interact with the monks there.
Hmm.
And that's what really, really got my adventure, my spiritual adventure going, rather than just kind of the world travel bug.
Hmm.
So that's in, I guess, in a really short synopsis. That's kind of how what I experienced.
So it sounds like the Ecuador experience was quite pivotal for you in terms of ending one story and beginning another. Would you say that?
Absolutely, yeah. There's kind of there was so a big thing in Ecuador too was the extreme loneliness that I felt. So those last 3 months that I mentioned, kind of my world travel bug ended while I was still living abroad. And the last 3 months, I was like, I'm shifting towards this new spiritual kind of focus. And then I would be in my room by myself, like meditating and just like walking around my bed, listening to podcasts and audiobooks. And I was like, wow, I've never been this lonely in my life.
Hmm.
But I learned so much about my consciousness at that point.
Hmm.
Um, so the loneliness key. Part two was key.
Yeah, I remember some of that from that experience as well. For me, it was more on the front end. When I got there, I remember. I mean, I even this is funny that this is coming up, but I'll share it. This is probably the most embarrassing moment of my life. Speaking of insanity, I sent a very incoherent and kind of emotionally inconsolable email to like everyone in my address book.
I did
Uh,
that too.
really?
Yes.
What a bizarre experience for us to share. That I mean, perhaps this is a culture shock phenomenon that we could have been warned about. But yeah, I mean, it was the deepest, rawest reaching out for intimacy without awareness of what was going on. Yeah, I wrote everyone in my address book. And for like a month after, every time I checked my email, there would be one more, response. And I would like cringe before I read it because I was so embarrassed. But yeah, I do remember that sensation of I'm in this place where I don't know anyone. The people I'm living with are foreign to me. Even my friends in this circumstance are new to me, and I don't even speak the language. It's really a disorienting sensation, and it does challenge the sense of self, I think, in a big way, in a way that I didn't have the resources to understand or withstand at that time.
So what were some things that you learned about yourself as you were, heading back to the States after your experience there?
Um, I learned that I still didn't know what I was doing with my life or
Yeah.
why. The Ecuador experience had kind of forestalled that confrontation. Um, I learned that, I mean, in Ecuador, it became clear to me that I was a teacher, but I struggled for the next several years with what kind of teacher to be and how to situate that in the world. And that's still a project for me. My spirituality is something that continues to inform and change my orientation to teaching. Um, and perhaps that will just be a lifelong interaction, but I don't feel that it's reached any sort of stable state as yet. Um, I think I was I think I was more skeptical of and disillusioned with US culture as well than I had been previously. Um, as you remember from Ecuador, there is a slower pace of life and a more communal um, value set. Those stereotypes I feel are true. People down there will spend the whole day together, just chatting and drinking coffee and thinking nothing of it. Here we have a holiday where we do that once per year, and it's a big deal. Um, so I came back and I was kind of like, wow, all we do in this culture is work. We're very
Mm.
alienated from one another. Um, not only do we not value the environment, we have very little access to nature. A lot of the time when people say like, I like spending time in nature, a cynical part of me laughs. I'm like, what is nature? Like a park in a single block in a city.
Would just
Strip
drive
of
your huge
grass.
camper out to the middle of the woods and hook up your AC.
Right. So yeah, I think maybe I had more of a lens onto the absurdities of our culture, but yeah, I wouldn't say the Ecuador experience was pivotal for me in the way it was for you. My crisis point and my inner revolution was still a couple years later. So it was more just like returning home with, okay, I know I'm a teacher. I know I'm good at that, but I don't know what that means. And I'm kind of uncomfortable with my position in the world. Those were, I would say, the two main things.
Sure. Do you want to dive into that a little bit?
Into which,
Into like your let's start with like what were you doing for a job as you got back to the States, and your living situation and your spirit, kind of your spiritual growth at that time, and then you mentioned this crisis point. So could you talk about those two?
well, I guess, yeah, I guess now that it was fairly quick actually. Now that I think about it, so I worked for a summer in Denver at a nonprofit, doing something that was totally irrelevant um, to my deeper values. Then I tutored writing at my old college, and that was when that shooting took place that I spoke about earlier. So that was the crisis point. I moved back to Denver. I was still tutoring writing at a different college. I was teaching ESL in the evenings. So that was a continuation of what we did in Ecuador. Um, yeah, and that was when I began going to therapy. So for me, that was really like getting in touch with my heart again. So it, ha- it the change began to happen for me gradually over the few years after I came home from Ecuador. Another significant thing was dating people, cultivating relationships with women, and learning how to be intimate with another person. That was something that had become very, very scary for me in my strongly mentally identified life. I thought, I can't do this. I don't know how to do this. It's too much of a burden, too much responsibility. So I began to unlearn that as well. But yeah, it was after that shooting and the extreme isolation it represented, and then following that, going to therapy and getting more in touch with my body and with other people.
Yeah. So, with how at this time with kind of the therapy, we can kind of go back to how you brought that into like your daily life. So how as you were growing and kind of working, learning more about the shadow side of your life or subconsciousness and kind of the deep kind of emotional impressions that you had in your body and learning more about that. How did that manifest into your friendships, your relationships, and like your working with your coworkers, things like that?
Yeah, it's funny. I believe that with any therapist or with any spiritual teacher, we will get out of it what we bring into it. So if the intention is very strong, if the desire is very strong, then there can be, like a revolution of self. And that's what I experienced because my suffering at that point was so great. So it was like, I'm going to wholly invest in this person. I'm going to trust whatever they say, and I'm going to do it. I'm going to put it into practice. The therapist I saw had an existential orientation. And so a lot of it was about, say you have a story about something that happened when you were very young. For instance, my parents got divorced, so woe is me, my parents got divorced. I don't know how to have a relationship. I'm not going to be able to do it because of this past event. She really confronted me with, it's you in the present holding on to and creating that story. No one else is doing that to you anymore. Your parents don't even live in the same state. And she had a very kind of blunt modality. A bit cold in hindsight. Like, that's not how I prefer to teach, but whatever, it functioned. And then from there, this links up with the David Hawkins book, actually, that we were talking about earlier. If you are holding on to this story, which we could call a victim story, there must be some reason. There must be something you gain through doing it. David Hawkins refers to these as the secret pleasures of the ego. Like, the ego wants to remain attached to anger because it gets to feel right, in its conflict with the other person. Anger is equated with rightness. So yeah, I began to learn, like, I am the cause of my own suffering in this moment, and I'm doing it for a secret purpose, and all I have to do is let go of that purpose, and the suffering will dissipate as well. In terms of the consequences this had in my friendships and work, this is the reason I laughed at the beginning and said, that I really experienced a revolution with this therapist. My life became very turbulent. I feel I was going through growth at a rate that I didn't know how to integrate into my life or process, really. And so a lot of friendships fell away, some in violent fashion. I would quit jobs and not know what I was going to do to pay my rent the next month. Just like, I'm not, connecting with this work environment. I'm out of here. And I think there's something to be said for understanding our feelings that well, but I think there's also something to be said for practicality. And I had to, I had to learn to integrate this new understanding of my feelings and my ability to, like, control or affect my environment. I had to integrate that understanding with a more practical, just mode of proceeding through life.
So it sounds, I've kind of had this issue too in my life, is like one of our weaknesses might be, how do we just like consistently make a living and like follow a quote unquote normal career, but also not giving into it completely and say, I'm still myself. I'm getting a paycheck, but I'm going to be myself doing that. And I might lose this job, but I'll find another one, I hope, and still be myself. I don't know if that rings true for you or.
Well, it does. Yeah, I think part of what spiritual growth is certain dispositions or personality traits just exhaust themselves, and so we have to make these kinds of mistakes again and again. So I've gotten to the point where I'm not going to rashly quit the job without a plan anymore. And I've gotten to that point simply because I've done it so many times that the urge is no longer there. It's not like um, the form of wisdom that can head off a crisis. It's simply that the desire has spent itself. And I think the same thing has happened with relationships. You know, part of why I have a fiance, I'm going to get married. Part of why is enough times it happened that I left the relationship at the drop of a hat that now I know not to do that anymore. I'm like, okay, this is a negative feeling coming up. Um, it doesn't really have anything to do with her or me. It's just a feeling, and I don't have to act on it. I don't have to sabotage myself or the relationship. So yeah, for me, that like desire to flee, having spent itself, what that means in work is that rather than try to find a new job that's going to better fit my personality or my philosophy or whatever, my project is letting my philosophy, my beliefs inform my work. And perhaps there will be a phase where that has exhausted itself as well. And it is time for me to be on my own doing some entrepreneurial thing. It's just not the time for that right now. And so currently I'm in grad school. I'm a TA, and I do a lot of writing in academia. And it's like, spirituality is the dominant part of my life, and that is going to bleed into all the work I do. And I don't know what that means, but I'm just going to allow it to happen. And so that's where I find myself in regard to this issue at this moment. It seems like you, because we were talking before we started the interview, it seems like you are doing a similar thing. You're a middle school teacher, high school teacher, both?
Both.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I've also in Ecuador I figured out that I want to be a teacher. I connected with my students there very, very closely, and I decided that I want to every day I want to teach others, but also work with people. Like I want to work with people at my job and interact with them instead of be one of those people who are in front of a computer and might go a whole day without interacting with like a client. And so for me, like I could be myself explaining kind of regular ideas, like whether it was English grammar, Spanish grammar, or social studies, it didn't really matter. I did eventually go back to Minnesota. I taught ESL to adults for 2 years at a community center, and then I decided to apply for grad school to become a public school teacher. So that's what I did. I student taught last spring, and now this is my first year teaching in kind of a rural high school in southern Minnesota. So I've been doing that. It's been really, really fun, challenging as well. Lots of work, but also a lot of growth and thinking about like, how do I find this balance between my spiritual side of my life, which seems to be becoming the majority of my energy. But I still want to maintain this 49%, 40% of like, I have my career as well. And I want to align that 40% of energy with like this abundance of energy that I have for spirituality that I think about like all the time. And that's been helping out tremendously in the last month, especially since Christmas break, is interacting with students and being like, I'm trying to create the space in my classroom for you to be yourself, and not just for one student. I have 30 students in every class, 20 to 30 students. And my goal is to keep my job, do well at my job, but also I mean, I don't know if the school system is ready for this big shift towards care, love, peace, self-exploration that these kids need. Like they're still rebelling against this rigidity of the school system, of test scores, and it's even getting worse. Like since George Bush administration, since 2000, it's becoming actually more and more quantifying education, putting a number to it, and schools get money for these test scores. It's like this cycle that's just unhealthy, that's just focused on seeing kids as machines that can eventually become these workers at their
More
9 to 5
polished machines.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And so you can see in young people's eyes that they're tired of the system. They can see that it's inherently unsustainable as well. Like I teach geography and I talk about climate change all the time, which is like paradox, because we're talking about climate change, but then I'm printing all these materials for them. We're going fast through the curriculum. I have to give them exams. It's just, it's tough to see them struggle through that. Yet still they rely on you as the teacher to be not just the teacher, but also the mentor. And they really, really trust you to make them feel welcome in the classroom. So, do you have any, I guess I don't have a question, but do you have any responses to?
Well, yeah, I'm thinking a lot because you said a lot, and I think about all these same things. I'm in grad school in education, and when I talk about inserting spirituality into education, what I mean is precipitating a change of value for the system as a whole. And I'm well aware that I am not some isolated genius, to link with my story earlier, who is the only person who's thought about this, but rather that I am part of a broad movement that is rippling through our culture, where everyone, you, me, many other people, our students as well, sense that the system is not working and that there is a more healthy and sane way to do things. I actually believe that that's the trajectory. I've worked in public schools as well, and what you say is true. It accelerated under the Bush administration, and Obama added to this problem as well. The intensification of the quantification and the pace, which to me, as I said with one of my colleagues when I started at this grad school, is doing the wrong thing faster. It's like, if we do it faster, that's somehow going to solve the problem. But what it's doing is hastening the absurdity of the system, which is the point at which people just give up. And I've had confidence in this, I guess, first in less articulate form, but now I'm able to voice it, starting with the experience with the shooting. What that experience really crystallized for me was this kind of sensation and dynamic of self-destruction, and how one can become self-destructive in one's orientation to life. And in that moment, I dislocated somewhat from our culture and was able to see our culture has the same tendencies as this man who became a mass shooter. We live in this violent, lost culture that is accelerating at this unsustainable pace, as you say. And yes, when I worked in schools, I could see that the students knew that too. And that made me less able to enforce the rules, because the students and I shared that unspoken understanding. And I think that solidarity will eventually reach a point where we all just throw up our hands and say, you know what, this isn't making sense, let's do it differently. It's not going to be a singular moment, but gradually it's happening already. Schools are eager to try out alternatives because we know that this is not the way.
Yeah, and I feel the difference even within the same school, the same school system, where the middle school is going this way, the high school is going that way, and since I'm working at at both, it's very interesting to see the different emphases, and obviously I'd rather be kind of on board with the one that's kind of going towards the spirituality that I connect with personally. And it's not just that. You don't have to label it as spirituality, right? What I'm going to work on is, how do I bring these ideas into a secular system? I mean, public schools, I mean, their definition is secular, right? But how can we bring this secularism? It's almost this next level of like oneness. Like it could be secular, but it could also be this oneness. And it doesn't have to be one particular religion. You know, people in our culture tend to think, oh, this is meditation, this is just non-Christianity, right? There's this line between Christianity and then there's over there, that's meditation, you know. I think if maybe one of the issues with the idea of meditation and mindfulness is the emphasis on the quieting of the mind only, right? Because it's hard in our culture. People are addicted. Like my phone just blinged, you know. People are addicted to these phones, and their minds are just going boom, 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 boom. And then we say, oh, you should try meditation. Sit in a chair and not think. That's not going to be attractive to people. I think people should try meditation when they feel ready. So it needs to be framed in some sort of secular idea where it's like, maybe discover yourself, find your passion. Like even talking about peace, you know, people connect with that. But if you say try and quiet your mind, I mean, that should not be step one. And I think that's a kind of a wrong emphasis that that when people are trying to bring meditation into the like school system or other secular institutions, I think they have the right intention, but that's again that maybe shouldn't be step one. Do you have any responses to that idea?
Well, these technologies too have been watered down in their application to schools. It may not seem so at the surface level, but they're just another instance of the hastening of the crisis or the acceleration of the wrong way. And I think that's because of the individual lens through which they're applied. So they really become just another behavioral control mechanism. You know, you are going to sit in this meditation room so that when you come back to class, you can be productive. So it still has that aim. Whereas if you look to the original wisdom traditions like Buddhism, it was connected to ethics, it was connected to a sense of community, interbeing. So yeah, it's just another manifestation of the same symptom of the wrongness with our culture. I have faith that in the end, just in the same way that my harmful dispositions one by one have exhausted themselves, that will happen in schools. People will just say, you know what, the way we're doing it is not working. We need to take our lead from another source than the human mind. And that lead is spirit. Spirit is always waiting with the answer until the human is receptive. There's no deadline, you know, for the soul. It's like, okay, whenever you guys have had your fill of this chaos, the sane manner of proceeding is going to be here. So I just think we're getting very close to that point with the kind of you know, rates of depression and anxiety and things like that you're seeing in schools. That's not natural for young children to be experiencing that. And on some level, they know that too. Like something's really off here. So I have faith that we're very close to this point.
Yeah, I kind of feel it too. Like, I mean, from my experience, I'm kind of settling into this, not a plateau, but it's like a contentedness in my spirituality. Whereas before it was like this very vehement passion, like I have to figure this out right now, and just like so much emphasis on the efforting of spirituality. Like I got to try and learn this, try and become enlightened. But now in the kind of this contentedness, I'm realizing that like the school system, yeah, it needs to change fast, but also it'll change at the right pace, because of like, I mean, you just got to trust that the process is going, that everything is happening so that it can change forever. Like it can make that natural shift instead of forcing it. So kind of the school system is kind of a nice metaphor for the ego, where
Mhm.
it's just something that we have to work with. Like we can't change our ego from A to ego B, right? That's what revolution is. So we don't need necessarily a revolution tomorrow. It's like, how can we take the institution that we have and improve it the best that we can step by step so that people can enjoy going to school, right?
Mhm.
Like it's also like, how can I begin to enjoy being myself, being Jackson, being Kyle? How can we enjoy being that? I think that's kind of another emphasis that we could have, rather than sit down for 20 minutes in your chair and then go to math class and be productive. Yeah, kind of like what you were saying.
Well, yeah, it's a different value system. The subtext of school, in my view, is that money will make you happy. I was never explicitly told that in school, but kind of the last uh, mountain that people have fallen back on in this rhetorical justification of current practices or why we're doing things the way we're doing them is, well, we need to, a lot of it is about equity now. We need to like raise these kids out of poverty and get them good jobs, and you can't get a good job without an education. So it's all reinforcing the system that we have through the school and through the children who pass through it. Um, and we know, and we've known for a long time, that life is about more than money and about more than having a good job. Some of the happiest people throughout history have always been monks who've taken a vow of poverty, and just live simply. They live simply, but they're engaged in self-examination and right relationship with the world around them. And those things have never been a focus of school. Hence, they've been marginalized, and a struggle I've had, like you, is because of this world in which we live, the split self. I have my professional self, and then I have my spiritual self, and that exists in different environments. Um, and I think we're learning to integrate the two. And I think people like you and I, merely by virtue of existing in traditional environments as our true selves, are part of that process. We don't have to do anything more. Our existence itself is revolutionary. Like, the system has to change to allow unusual beings to inhabit it. And again, like, knowing we're not alone is a huge consolation in this process. When I look around me in graduate school, what other people are doing as their, realms of study would have been unthinkable like 10, 20 years ago. And that's always the case. That is accelerating too, at the same pace as the elements that aren't working.
So I guess we can move kind of towards. So I watched your kind of your first teaching video that was about an hour long, and I was amazed. I couldn't believe like so it was both coherent in the sense that like you had these three principles that you focus. So I want to ask you about each one of those, but also you explain them in such a way that it, you brought those big concepts like love and peace, but also into the sense of like being a person.
Hmm.
I feel like a lot of teachers sometimes just focus on the big abstract like expansiveness, but also the bringing it down to, like you talked about, trauma, being a person, things like this. I don't know if you want to begin to explain like how do you find a balance between these two seemingly opposing sides?
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, in similar fashion to wanting to be one's true self and wanting to be of service in any environment, I think you're speaking about two levels of experience, and I want to explore and be useful at both those levels because they're both very important to me, and I have insights on both. Um, I think part of being a spiritual teacher too is, I've always been an observant and insightful person. It's just at a certain point we become suffused with enough confidence through the love of others or ways in which we're cushioned by the world that it's impossible not to share what we know. We're just filled up with that urge to share. So that's what's been happening for me. It's not a choice anymore. So the first level, well, yeah, the first level is the level of the soul. It's in Buddhism, this would be called absolute reality. And it's the level at which we know time is an illusion. There is one consciousness experiencing itself through infinite beings. And so cliches like we are all connected have weight. They are in fact true. And that is the vantage of absolute love. Like, not only is it illogical to harm another being, with that level of awareness, you simply don't want to. And you are delighted to be witnessing experience because it's so beautiful, and you want to share your knowledge with others, and you want to let them know how beautiful they are and how much you love them. So that's that level. And I feel merely like articulating that in clear form, as I attempted to do in the video, will be helpful to a certain class of people who perhaps have less coherent inclinations in these directions, and so it can deliver that message, I'm not alone, when someone shares in the way I did. The other level is I have been individualized into this body and this consciousness, which has a story and has human problems that I deal with every single day. And the two are not separate, and having a strong spiritual identification enhances my human experience and vice versa. The more I'm aware that I'm a spirit having a human experience, the richer my human experience is too. But the level of the human experience is there are problems in life, and I learn to navigate them through trial and error. And once I accrue lessons about how to navigate life, I can articulate those lessons to others as wisdom. And I can form relationships in the world, and I can do practical things like be successful in my career or whatever. Those are all useful endeavors. So yeah, I guess I seek to show how the two are related and to make myself useful and available in both realms because I have insights in both.
Yeah, that's perfect. I was kind of wondering if you could explain some of the experiences that you had in your either events in your life or just kind of in your awareness or consciousness, like events that happened that were insights or into these teachings or lessons.
Um, how do you mean? Do you like moments of epiphany?
Sure, sure.
One big one that I've thought about a lot was really the breakthrough that I've had in meditation. This happened last summer. I was at a Buddhist retreat, and it wasn't anything like fanciful we were doing. We did uh, what is colloquially referred to as do nothing meditation. So you just sit for a long time. You can count if you want. You can think of a mantra if you want. There was very little direction, you know. It was funny actually because our group leader was like, first he was a very like casual and kind of aloof guy, and the first day he says, well, just count. And we're sitting for 2 40-minute sessions, and I didn't know that he meant count up to 10 and then begin
They
again
go
at 1.
back.
Yeah, so I just counted in a line, which I'm kind of proud of in hindsight. Like we finished though, and I'm like, I counted to like 250, and he's like, dude, that's not what you're supposed to be doing, you know. But anyway, I was doing this for 2 weeks, and it was really a holistic Zen life. So it was meditation intertwined with work periods, silent meals, Dharma talks. It was a wonderful time. And part of that was we did a full moon ceremony. So one longer period of meditation without breaks on the full moon, and we were wearing special garb. And there was a period in that where we did repetitious bows to the Buddha, 40 of us or however many were in that room, where I had what I think of as an ego death. So this was a massive evolution for me that happened last summer. I can articulate it now in language, but it really was an experience outside of that when it was occurring. I knew that rather than being a singular being bowing to the Buddha in that moment, that I was one consciousness among an infinite number that had bowed to that same symbol of wisdom throughout time and would continue to do so into infinity. And there was just this sense of, to use a common cliche, being a drop in the ocean. And although I snapped back to my singular consciousness after that, my sense of the world has never been the same. The two levels that I articulated earlier have been very clear to me. Like, I am a spirit that, for no clear reason I can discern, happens to be experiencing itself as Jackson. My individuality is an accident and is not foregrounded in my experience any longer. So that was a massive epiphany that came through the venue of Buddhism and through that particular meditation.
Yeah, so it's just interesting that I thought about this when I was in, those nights in high school where I couldn't sleep. I was like, why is my consciousness in this body? And I just kept asking that. And that's the first time that I realized that I'm not just this body. I'm, in one sense, I'm stuck in this body as Kyle, but just like I would say my name, Kyle, but I didn't feel like I was Kyle. Like, I'm stuck in Kyle, but I'm not. I'm like bigger, Yeah, and I don't know if you have had experiences similar to that, where it's like it's like the going back and forth. So yeah, like what was the experience after that? Like the next month, 2 months, how did you experience it going forward?
Part of what I get when you tell me your story is that perhaps it was too early for it to be peacefully integrated. But for me, enough other forms of learning had been undertaken that that was a fairly smooth event in its aftermath. So for instance, my fiance and I had a problem prior to this where I would interject into her stories with advice. She would be telling me something and I would be like, oh, this is what you should do. And she would feel not listened to or condescended to. and not appreciate it. And I would think, but I'm so smart. I have so much wisdom. Why don't you want to listen to it? And that was like a consistent drama for us. And I come back from these 2 weeks, this meditation retreat, and she's telling me this difficulty she's going through. And I'm just like, mm-hmm. And
Must be hard. Must be hard. All right. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, other than reflection, I didn't provide anything. And she was like, whoa, you've never done that before. Like, what's going on? And it's this, it's a detachment that can alarm people who haven't had this kind of experience. It's similar to the school discussion you and I were having earlier. It's like, at this level, at the level of identification with what I think of as the soul, other people might call it God, it's like, we actually don't have to intervene. We can, but if we do nothing, if the world reaches like absolute calamity, or if the other person does that we're interacting with, like that will be okay. It's this like indifference to outcomes that comes from the absolute peace which we are at core. So it's a very transformative thing to know. It's a thing that based on my experience of it, I would say happens to us rather than we can earn. You can meditate all you want, but this will happen if it is meant for you. So yeah, I mean, what about you? Like, I imagine those high school nights as very fraught, and very painful, just in the way you describe them.
Very painful, very, very painful. So I kind of imagine that for me, the beginning, like when I started meditating 3 years ago, the reason why it was such a smooth process was probably because I had those, anxiety, depression, like thoughts of like, who am I? Like existential crises, basically, and I went to therapy. I went to a psychologist and a psychiatrist, and the psychologist was perfect because I would just talk, and he would learn about who I am, and I was like, he's like, you're my favorite client. Like we just come and we just talk about life. It's great. But then I had to travel to a different town to the psychiatrist, and I took this test, and he's like, all right, you're gonna take Ritalin, you're gonna take these drugs.
Yeah.
And I was like, no, I'm not. I'm just
Good
like,
for
no,
you.
I'm
Yeah.
not gonna do that.
The psychologist is like, you're my favorite. The psychiatrist is like, you're absolutely insane.
You're insane. Take drugs. Yeah, really big difference. And then, but yeah, so it was at that point. So it was from then until now, 10 years of deep philosophy, psychology, learning about who I am, but especially learning about what is the world. So it was about 9 of those years, 9 of the 12 was like learning about what is the world. So that's why I studied political science and philosophy. And then it was that shift 3 years ago where it was like, but I'm one with the world. So at first it was an idea. So I had to figure out, how am I one with everything? So that's when I started meditating. And within the last, probably when I started this channel, but also especially within the last couple months, like I realized, it's it's who I am. Like I don't have to do anything. On one level I do, but like just by being myself, that's the most natural state.
Mm-hmm.
And at first it's like I was trying to be myself, but I didn't know exactly who I was.
Mm-hmm.
But now it's just, I know I'm being myself because of happiness, peace, and love. Like you said in your first tenet, which I want to read in your video, which I'll link below. Your principle number 1 is the fundamental nature of the universe is peace and love. So could you expand a little bit on how you realize this and what it means?
Yeah, it's a deep question to be confronted with all at once. Even if I said it, it's like, what? I said that? Um, no, it's
No,
not true. Um, yeah, it is. It is this knowing that that in aggregate, that is what the universe is, or at the level of spirit, that is what the universe is. It is this dispassionate, non-attached energy flowing through physical phenomena, and we are among those phenomena, these individual selves that you and I are. um it's knowing that contrastive experiences, so experiences that don't feel like peace and love, which are pretty much every experience at the level of the individual self that we have, it's knowing that those experiences exist to illuminate the peace and love underneath. So I may be in a situation as an individual being where I'm very frustrated. I am trying to achieve something and I think my boss or the bureaucracy at work is blocking me, for example. And I'm frustrated with that situation. I'm hitting a wall. It's knowing that that situation exists to show me that underneath it, throughout the entire situation, and regardless of what happens in the situation, there is this singular wavelength or vibration that we are all subject to and that is always passing through us, that I think of as the soul, um, and that it's absolutely content. Um, and so from this awareness, like you said a moment ago, we know that we don't need to do anything because no matter what we do, in a certain sense, it won't matter. Sometimes when I say this, I almost hear like a second voice in my head because it sounds cynical. It sounds like
Nihilistic.
well, yeah, it sounds like I'm writing off everything that would be meaningful in life. But it is my finding that by letting go of these sacred cows or what have you, just the pleasure of being oneself emerges. You know, like you said, and I have alluded to as well, like I am Jackson by accident. I could be any other being. There is a shared energy pervading other beings right now. Like I believe that the energy that inhabits me inhabits you as well. So my experience of myself as Jackson is ultimately arbitrary. But in an odd way, knowing that allows me to fully embrace and enjoy it. It's like this is a mysterious thing that's happening that I get to be a part of, and I will be a part of it no matter what I do. So the primary orientation actually becomes one of play. It's like, wow, like we have, 80 years in this form to do whatever I want in life. That's amazing. Um, yeah, just the whole value system changes in a way that provides lightness and freedom. Um, yeah, but it comes from that knowing of the like inessential quality of our choices and their outcomes, when placed beside this absolute nature of peace and love that is the sum of all experiences. I have trouble in this moment knowing whether this will like register to anyone but you and me because we've read a lot of philosophy. It's hard for me to talk about it without using that language. But it feels so clear to me now, and that's a wonderful notion to always have with me. So I'm
Well,
curious if you could like put some of what I said in your own words and share how it aligns with what you think, maybe if there are any differences, because that might help me feel like, okay, it's translating.
no, I completely get it. But mostly on the sense of like, it's not just the words that you're saying. It's also just this feeling or sense. you're kind of like painting something that we all intuitively know is correct, but you don't actually need the words nor the paintbrush because it's like exactly what's happening. So I was kind of thinking of an example kind of in life is when you're communicating with a stranger. Um, I've been noticing lately like the importance of the smile, and by smiling at someone is a demonstration of vulnerability. So people think that vulnerability is bad sometimes, like, oh, I can't show my whole self to somebody. But when you kind of open up and you smile and you listen, active listening, you begin to see them like open up. Most people have not had the opportunity in life to have big spiritual adventures like you and I have, right? For them, it's being able to express themselves. So lately I've been figuring out, like, when I open to other people, like strangers or students, they just begin to just like unload the thoughts in their mind towards you. And you just kind of nod along like, oh yeah, interesting, and you end up listening for 5 minutes and they didn't ask you a question about yourself. That used to anger me. Like, this is like, conversations are supposed to be 50-50. What's going on? I want to talk about myself too. And that was kind of a big realization when I was in Ecuador. Was like, when I would go to dinner with my cohort that were Americans, the conversations were way different than the conversations I was having in Spanish with Ecuadorian people, because it was a constant competition for, now it's my turn to talk about my thoughts. And then it's going to be a battle, like, oh, this person over here who's talkative, they're going to talk about what's in their thought process, and it's also not just that. It's like they have these like judgments that they had in the process of this event. So it's like, I thought this, I thought that, and it's just like, this was bad, that was great. So it's like you can learn that a lot of people are stuck because they're judging things as good or bad to them. And that's kind of a sign, like, if you catch yourself doing that, that's an opportunity to say, wow, maybe can I take a step back and not judge the situation and see it not as neither good nor bad, but what can I learn from this conversation that I'm having with this stranger? Can I have this opportunity to share peace and love with them by opening up myself so that they can be themselves, right? I am myself, they are themselves. And we don't have to think about, well, how do I be myself? A lot of advice, when you go on your first date, your parents say, you're like, I'm nervous. Oh, just be yourself. It'll be fine. But you're 18. I don't know how to be myself.
Well, yeah, and then if she doesn't like me, it's really gonna hurt.
Yeah. So that's kind of being counterintuitive. If you're going on a date with someone that you have a crush on, being really calm and being vulnerable, that's the only way to go. Like, if you're trying to put on this persona, like, oh, like, I'm this tough guy, or I'm this rich guy, or I'm, or even if you, as a woman, you identify as, I'm beautiful, right? It's easy to identify as something that will eventually end. But when you just, or even your ego ends, like Kyle-ness and Jackson-ness, like, will ultimately end, right? So how can you, one of the hardest things is, how can you disattach from this story of yourself and really dive into, what is this connection that I have with other people? And going hiking in the woods, what is this connection I have with the trees and the sky and the ground, the earth, right? That's what I've been focusing on lately, is like how much the earth provides for us when we listen and when we feel the presence of the earth in our lives. It's so easy to forget that we come from the earth. We are the earth, and it's easy in our culture to forget that. So I think, I guess now I'm kind of rambling, but if you catch yourself in those moments, that can really, really help you learn. And I think that's really ultimately what it is learning. And I think you use the word exploration. That's definitely true too, is exploring for the sense of exploring.
Hmm. Um, you know what's funny? I don't think about or connect with nature as much as I feel a lot of other spiritual seekers do. Like I've had beautiful experiences in nature, but it's not central to my ideology or like what I envision myself as exploring more greatly in the future. You know, for me, it's almost like relegated to the level of just another pleasure. And I've had times where I thought like there must be something wrong with me. There must be a part of myself that is not yet revealed, or else I wouldn't feel that way. Um, I don't know. It just seems to be the case for me. I watched one of your videos and you were walking around and hiking, and I could see like the energy it was giving you. And, you know, so, like certainly when I'm having a beautiful experience in nature, it's filling me up with something. Yeah, it's just that it's not central in my conception of spirituality. So I wanted to voice that. I find it. I don't really know what to make of it.
Yeah, no, that's really really important to realize. And I had almost the opposite. Was growing up, especially since high school, like one of my key identities was like the outdoors. I want to be someone who's known as likes to go hiking, likes to travel, likes to go to national parks, likes to be in the middle of the woods. Um, it took me a long time to realize there's no boundary between society and the city and being out in the woods. And I can find this energy of nature in the city. And that really, really hit me while I was living in Quito, but also while I was living in Minneapolis, was like the beauty of, the buses going by, the cars, the people walking on the street, or even like the smell of the bus fumes in Quito. Like it's how the city as like a structure or a pattern is so intricate and beautiful. And it doesn't matter whether I prefer to be out in the woods or in the city. I mean, for me, I'd rather be out in the forest and breathing fresh air, but that's just me, you know, like I just, that's just how I was built and how I prefer, but how other people, it's really great for them to discover what's best for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it took me a long time to not judge people who don't like nature.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I used to always like judge people like, they like when I traveled through Tanzania in college, and we went to the safari out in the middle of Tanzania, and there was gigantic bugs like everywhere in our room because it was open, but like we had these mosquito nets, and there were still mosquitoes getting in. And it was just like bugs everywhere, gigantic bugs. And for me, I was just like loving it. Like, look, like nature's here, like all the way to our beds. Like there's no separation, but like, and that was miserable for like most of the people. And I couldn't help at that time just like judging them, like, what are we doing to ourselves? We're domesticating ourselves. Like, this is what we're meant to do. The outdoorsy guy just like
Right,
being
right.
intense about like, it's just bugs. Come on, guys, it's not a big deal. So that was a big step for me. Um, I don't know if you've had any steps like that where it's like you used to, your first 25 years of your life, judge people for doing a certain thing, but you realize by, knowing yourself and knowing the world that, I no longer need to judge people for being this way or doing these things. What was that for you?
Well, for me, that's a continual release. And it happens through relationships. And I think it's part of the purpose of having relationships is like to learn again and again what is my path versus what is the other person's path, and how both paths are okay, are necessary, This can become frightening as a thought experiment for some people when we think of people who, either in the present moment or throughout history, do terrible things. And to think that person's path is necessary in some regard for the evolution of the universe, just as mine is. For me, it happens in relationships when my judgment or my attempt to force the other person to live in my way is generating friction in the relationship, and either the relationship ends or the judgment dissolves and the relationship blossoms and takes a new form. And so it's just continually shown to me through those kinds of encounters, like, that judgment has to do with unresolved self-understanding and really nothing to do with the behavior of the other. And so it's like just another trespass through which to come to greater self-love. I'm judging the other because they're doing something that I have not accepted in myself. And once I accept that in myself, the whole situation transforms. But yeah, I can't say like that behavior is done for me. It continues to come up in new relationships, in new situations. It's really interesting to think of other beings as like servants of things to realize about ourselves, right? If the universe is this one consciousness generating experiences so that it can learn, so that it can have this kind of schooling experience, it's interesting to think of other people as like showing us things we haven't yet integrated. I guess a related discussion for me is karma. This is what I think of karma as. Karma is like my personality encountering its own limitations through the other person. Like, for instance, I think I'm a winner, right? That's like part of my identity. Like, I never lose. And I will necessarily encounter someone who's better than me at whatever sport or endeavor. And I'm going to have to work through the karma of losing. And through that, seeing that my personality was founded on something unsturdy or untrue. And so letting it dissolve into a more nuanced or deeper way of being. But yeah, I think through relationships, we're kind of always faced with that possibility. And it just happens throughout time. And either we grow in awareness in life, or the self dies, in which case it returns to absolute awareness anyhow. So it's like awareness is the outcome no matter the path.
It's like a win-win situation. Like, whether you're a self or you're just like blissed out in oneness, like it's just a win-win situation. Like, I mean, just to be a human, like, great, this is awesome. I get to learn about myself, learn about the world, make mistakes, trial and error, figure out what suffering is. Like, I get to learn how to deal with my pain, how to deal with my embarrassment, how to deal with my weaknesses. This is great. Like, but also just like experiencing the absolute silence. That's also amazing. Or experiencing the absolute love that we all carry in our hearts. That's also amazing. And so it's just like any situation that, we are gifted with is just an opportunity to learn or just appreciate or just be in. And kind of mentioning weaknesses or something and karma to come up to overcome for me has actually been my shyness. For a long time, I was actually some people maybe wouldn't see my shyness, but I know in my heart that I was shy for most of my life, because for me, I realized this recently, was my mind was my world. Like, thoughts I thought were the most real thing in life. Like, even more than the world, I would interpret it through my thoughts. And so I always wanted to guard my mind from other people. So my natural tendency was to like well, I'm just gonna go play sports, or I'm just gonna go out in nature and hike, or I'm gonna move to Ecuador where I don't have to deal with like my relationships. So some people think like, Kyle, you were so brave for living abroad in a whole nother country. For me, that was the comfort zone, actually.
Hmm.
At the time, I thought it was going outside of my comfort zone. In one sense, I was, but really, it was just like it was a continuance of my shyness and my inability to deal with my self-expression to the people that were in my life, like close friends, family. So now what I'm working on is like, how can I bring myself to my relationships?
Hmm.
So, and I've never thought about that before. For me, it's always been ideas.
Hmm.
And so now it's just like when I think about relationships, they're just so intimate and so nuanced. Like for me, human beings, I'm falling in love with human beings because of this nuance, complexity, ups and downs of our emotions. Like there is so much nature in us, to learn. So it's just like my idea of nature is expanding into the human realm. And I mean, it's just amazing. And um, so I'm trying to wonder, is there a weakness for you that you've always had that is kind of almost becoming a strength or something you're working on in your life?
Well, I have a very similar character orientation, which does not surprise me, just from what I've gleaned about you. But yes, for me, like I spoke earlier about how I cultivated the identity of being smart, and that saw me through my crisis point, which then birthed my spirituality. That's the mind as refuge. And it's the same thing, whether through turbulence in my family or early schooling experiences or whatever else was going on, I got the message that it was safe in my mind and I didn't have to risk anything if I just remained there. And that really galvanized my intellectual nature for a long time. And you ask whether the weakness is now becoming strength. Yeah, it's like when one has a strong mind, one is able to articulate things or create things in ways that are helpful to others. And so my communication is also my gift. If anyone watches that video and feels seen, then that is me using my mind to be useful to the world. My greatest fear in life has always been being useless, and that's the fear that the detached life of the mind perpetuates, because it's like I'm only in here thinking all the time, I'm not engaged in the world, therefore I have no function in society, I have no practical skills. And so for me, relationships, and like drawing income and making a living and practical things like that have revealed themselves as the real sites of like karma or work for me in this life. Being intelligent is very easy. I've already done that in a way it was given to me through my life circumstances. And then yeah, it's these other things that are more scary. But I'm really proud of like how far I've come in those regards. Being married, which I'm going to do this year, was like something I couldn't even imagine up until probably a year ago. I was so terrified of it, of failing, quote unquote, in a relationship, whatever that would mean. So yeah, through the spiritual path, I've really become able to recognize these limitations or growth areas, and like just allow myself to step into them, because it's the higher direction of my soul. It's what the soul wants to do. The soul does not want to. Actually, if I were to attempt to remain, in the isolated, easy life, it would kill me. It would. I mean that literally. My soul would find a way to off itself. It would be intolerable. So it's like, this is the path of life for me in this body, in this personality.
Yeah, so for you, it definitely seems like one of the key elements of a spiritual life is building strong relationships. Um, so could you kind of like summarize why that, like why are relationships so important in spiritual growth?
Well, I'm not sure I would say that. I would say they are important in my story. There might be another person for whom, let's say, they're born in a very codependent and like suffocating family. And for this person, a major growth edge is I'm going to become independent and I'm going to show that I can do things on my own, you know, and that might be terrifying and almost inconceivable for that person. So for me, each individual story comes with its own goals and hardships. And it just so happens that in mine, relationships and intimacy are very, very important. But I think this is where we get back to what you and I were touching on earlier, the live and let live principle. It's like, I don't think that's the highest priority for everyone. It just happens to be important for me.
Yeah, definitely. And like one thing I've realized too is everyone has their own path, and some teachers in the spiritual community are, you know, focused on like this is how it is, and this is what you need to do to become enlightened. So in one sense, that's kind of true. Is like, I mean, you need to kind of train your mind somehow. You have to kind of calm your mind, calm your body in some way. But for everybody, that's totally unique because of our unique structures as selves. And in some way, like you are your path, you are your spiritual path. And so like learning from spiritual teachers is vital, but especially for people in Western cultures, like learning about how you function in the world and figuring out how you can become your best self is your path. And I really appreciate that from you, is emphasizing like, you know, this works for me, and this is what I've learned from it. And now for you, so I guess my question is like, as a spiritual teacher, when that is your emphasis, is like the goal is to figure out how it works for you. How do you how are you going to try and be as straightforward and useful as possible, or kind of almost like a sense of efficiency? Like, how do we make this process, since we as spiritual teachers say we were the ones who made mistakes in our path, and our goal is to make the spiritual path easier for other people so like they can learn the lesson. So how do you as a spiritual teacher deal with this phenomenon of students needing to figure out the path for themselves, but also you as a spiritual teacher have made those mistakes before, but this is a different human being,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, I think it's funny. That's the paradox of it. I read Eckhart Tolle's new book over this Christmas break, and he says in the beginning, like, one of the oddities of being a spiritual teacher is that in the conventional sense, we have nothing to offer. You are awakening others to the truth of their path rather than supplying any sort of product or resource in the conventional sense. And so one problem is like, how does that get situated in an economy? And I think that's why many spiritual teachings become diverted into like, or not diverted, perverted into, you know, action steps, because they can be more easily commodified and sold. That's not really true to the spiritual path. Yeah, for me, it's like knowing that this is the first thing to clear up. not everyone is meant to teach all students. You know, some people are going to learn through mushrooms or ayahuasca. Some people are going to learn through yoga. Some people are going to learn through art, so on and so forth. I have a mental disposition, and I'm conversational. I'm non-confrontational in my approach. I prefer to tease out truths and let them be. And those approaches are going to be appropriate for some people and not for others. So at one level, there's the humility as a teacher to know that I have my crowd and it's limited. Going back to education for a second, this is not something that currently exists in the structure of our education system, right? You receive an arbitrary classroom of students, and if the student doesn't like you as a teacher, they don't get to leave because they were assigned to you. When we seek out teachers for something like spirituality, intuitively, we know that we get to choose the teacher who works for us. It's a different orientation. But so that's one level. Another is recognizing what is arbitrary or is only my experience and framing it as such. So if I'm giving advice on the practical level of, here's something you can do in your life to assist with this choice, saying, now this is only my experience, but here's what I would do. This frees the other person to make whatever choice they want or feels appropriate to them, while knowing what choice I would make and also the context of my life that gives that choice credibility. So it's kind of like foregrounding the freedom of the other person to choose at every juncture. And then even at the highest level of receiving intuition that feels disembodied, in other words, doesn't feel necessarily linked to the Jackson story, it's like knowing that although it is objective or ethereal or divine knowledge, it is still being channeled through this vessel, which is human. And so always kind of being mindful of that bracketing with the other person, you know, knowing that something I say may not be right for them, and that's okay. Yeah, so I think it's just about like humility and that awareness and that trust that there will be a teacher for everybody. It is not our job to fix. And going back to what you said earlier, I don't think it's even our job to make the spiritual path easier. It's going to be what it's going to be. You know, my awareness is by virtue of the difficulty that I've faced. Yeah, so it's like, what do we really have to provide? Just attention and love and reflection as people walk their individual paths, which illuminates the greater awareness experiencing that path. And perhaps that's the greatest gift we can offer.
Yeah, it's almost like, instead of giving it as like a recipe, here's the recipe to enlightenment. It's like, well, these are the values to remember in the path that has yet to, it hasn't, your story of enlightenment has not been totally written yet. So nobody really even knows what's going to happen for each person. And knowing where are the pitfalls, but also, the values that you need to remember. And especially, I think, trusting the process at the beginning is really, really hard, because you haven't had that big, expansive awareness yet of like, oh, like I can trust life 100%. That's really hard for someone who hasn't had that connection, that sense of oneness yet, where oneness is still an idea that they read in a book, or that they heard on a podcast, or that they even intuitively realized in biology 101 in college, that like, wow, all of these the body is like, it's all connected, it's all one. It's like all these energies are flowing, and like it's almost too perfect to be random.
Hmm.
um and so when that's an idea, it's like, and it hasn't happened in your own awareness yet, like I can trust 100% is, that's kind of what I've been thinking about lately, is that as an important, really, really important guide. But also love, just um, the importance of loving yourself, loving others, and loving the moment. Like,
Hmm.
no matter what is happening, um, as you love it, as you love the process more and more of the ups and downs of life, it's just like, uh, it doesn't really matter what ultimately is happening in the moment, because I love it whether it's teaching, because it can teach, has the opportunity to teach me who I am, what the world is, who God is, and who the other people in my life are. And also just that leads to this contentedness of, I don't need to be seeking over here or seeking over there. It's like, I could be, if that's really what excites me in the moment, if that's my intuition, but also I don't need to. Finally the idea, like, oh, I don't need to do that seeking anymore. I don't need to stay attached to this, like, I'm a spiritual guy, I'm a spiritual dude. It's an ego in and of itself. It's like, that becomes an identity, like you're the spiritual person.
Hmm.
But when you finally realize and take a breath, you're like, oh, I don't have to be that even. I can be me.
Hmm.
And that's just a huge breath of fresh air.
Hmm.
I don't know, when did you have that realization for you was that during that Buddhist meditation? Uh,
I think it's connected with that, and it's the knowing that the true you is always a spiritual vehicle. In fact, that it was always that way and could be no other way. So there are people right now, laying brick somewhere or cooking a meal for their children who are acting as spiritual guides and granting that love and awareness to life that we're talking about. It's just happening. It's unavoidable. Um, yeah, and so it's that knowing that we don't really have to do or be anything that paradoxically allows the acceptance of the true self. Um, you were speaking earlier about trust and how that can be difficult to come to for someone just starting out along the path. And I think that's because of not having a sufficient quantity of love. It's like most people have been very scared in their life or been very hurt in their life or both, and that's been the dominant experience. And so to have someone there who is kind to them and consistent is the greatest gift. That enables trust. It's not like there's some radical leap of faith that happens at a moment. It's like, I have enough experiences where people told me it was going to be okay, and it was, that I know I can do something incrementally bigger and bigger and bigger, and that it's going to be okay. Um, and so this is where, like, any divisions among, discourses of privilege that you and I were talking about earlier and spirituality, they really break down for me. It's like, if you are a person gifted with confidence and love, it is incumbent upon you to share that with others, and you won't really have a choice. You won't want to function in the world any other way. It just, that energy overtakes us. Once it lives within us, it becomes kind of the dominant force in our lives.
Absolutely. And another one I was just thinking of is kind of when you're on this spiritual path, but even before you begin your spiritual path, kind of your mindset is like, I am the one that's um, uh, the driver of my life. I'm the one driving the bus. And when you realize that you've spent so much energy in your life thinking that you're the driver of the bus of your life, that finally when you take a step back and realize, wow, the whole time I wasn't the driver when I thought I was, and in the future I'm not going to be the driver either. Yet, even though you're not the driver, you still need to make choices. Paradoxically, right? It's like I was the driver, so like I think I was the one making all the turns in my life. But now it's a total paradox where yes, you don't have any control at all in your life. Yet you, maybe a different you, needs to make the right choices to continue on the path of love and peace, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
So letting go of that will to be the one dominating your own experiences is a nice breath of fresh air as well.
Well, and in any like choice juncture, in my experience, the right answer will always be present with surrender. You know, you let go of the illusion of driving the bus and you still know which road to take. And it's often mysterious. That's how I know when I am leading the right, quote unquote, or the proper spiritual path. It's because I no longer have a reason for what I'm doing. It's like, this just seems to be right intuitively. Might be scary to me, might seem like I'm causing conflict in the world sometimes, which is something I don't want to do, for instance, speaking up for myself. But it just kind of comes from underneath and directs me. And with more and more experiences of surrender, it's easier and easier to trust that sensation and know, like, it's a paradox, you know. Yes, there are choices, but there also are not, because with each choice you're going to find a divinely inspired impulse. You'll have the sensation of choice until it exhausts itself, and then you'll know what to do, and it happens again and again, and it just renews itself. And that's the sign that as a soul in a human body, you are learning. You're being presented with these new opportunities. I read this thing the other day. It was like signs you're on your path, and one was about like being like invigorated by life and feeling like faced with dilemmas and choices. And I was like, that's my experience every single day, no matter what I'm doing. So I must be on the path.
On the path, yeah. On the right track. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good feeling.
We've been doing this for 2 hours, so I'm wondering what you what your intention is.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say kind of the same thing. I was gonna make sure. Are there any last thoughts or messages that prior to this conversation you would have thought I really want to talk about this? Is there any kind of last words as to that?
I guess I want to say that I think of myself as a spiritual teacher, but at the same time, I have a sense that we as humanity are reaching the phase where, through our awareness of oneness, such a thing becomes almost impossible to say. It's like there are not people anymore who are spiritual teachers and people who are not spiritual teachers, but rather there is just a spiritual experience occurring through all living things. And if some of us have language for this or make a path or even livelihood through articulating it, that doesn't make us any better or different than anyone else. So just something I've been coming to feel about, like, the collective nature of this awareness in this moment. I see all those sorts of distinctions, spiritual versus secular, as collapsing and dissolving, and I have a sense that it's not in my mind alone that that's occurring, but in our world more broadly. So that was something I wanted to share.
That's perfect. Well, this is a perfect 2 hour conversation. Um, I'm hoping that, maybe in the next couple months we could do this again.
I
Um,
think that would be great. Yeah. I really enjoyed it. I don't know who will watch such a thing, but I see that you have subscribers on your YouTube channel, which is very inspiring to me.
yeah, I'm just hoping to reach a few people, like hopefully they get something out of it. I'm going to be doing this no matter what, even if, 1 or 2 people listen to it, that's fine with me. Or if there's more, that's great too. But also my big goal is to form a community. I was talking about this with my friend today. Is For the longest time, I thought my spiritual path was about me, but now I'm realizing it's really about forming a community and networking with each other to bring the message of love and peace to everybody. Like
Hmm.
it's not exclusive at
Hmm.
all.
Hmm.
And I want to get to know others because also they express love and peace and oneness in their unique way. So I have something to learn from them by interacting with them. So that's definitely my big goal now with my channel. So it's been kind of back and forth in what my channel's been about, but that's kind of where I'm seeing it going right now. So
That's wonderful and a great gift that you are giving people. Um, yeah. Yeah, because there may be some people who are more isolated or more alienated at this point in time, as you and I both have been in our paths. And if watching a video like this could be kind of a jumping off point for such a person, that's a wonderful thing.
absolutely, for someone to know that, if you don't know anybody else in your life who talks about this stuff, like making a connection online is kind of a good first step, and then finally meeting that person in your life that is thinking about this stuff is amazing.
Mm.
So I would encourage some people to, if you need to drive to a different state, you might need to do that, but interacting with others who are equally as passionate as you are, it makes a huge difference.
Well, and that does make me want to say one more thing, which is, earlier you asked about like the after effects of going to therapy for me, and I talked about how friendships fell out of my life. Well, the converse is true too. Like, as you continue along the spiritual path, you will begin to meet people who are aligned with the deeper aspect of your nature. It happens magnetically. That's how you and I came into contact with each other again. It's just the old friendships that are no longer in tune fall away, and romantic relationships, all kinds of relationships, and other ones emerge. So that's a really wonderful process to be a part of.
Absolutely. So as some doors close, other ones open.
That's what they say. All right, thank you
I'll,
so much, Kyle.
yeah, thank you so much. Hopefully talk to you again soon.
Yeah, I'd like that. All right, bye,
All
man.
right, bye.